Who doesn't love Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the arcade game? After all, this coin-munching masterpiece didn't just define a generation of beat-em-ups, it devoured pocket money faster than Michelangelo could inhale a pizza. But while many remember it for its blistering 4-player chaos down at the local leisure centre, that's only half the story, as of course what followed was a whirlwind of wildly ambitious and often downright bizarre attempts to cram that arcade magic into home consoles, computers, and even hardware that had no right trying to run it. So grab your bandana, ready your bow staff, and join me as we kick, punch and pizza power our way through the history of this classic, as well as some of its strangest incarnations. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the arcade game and its crazy ports. Yeah! If like me you prefer your retro collections to come bursting out of the sewers with more content than a Foot Clan armory, then you'll be thrilled to know that Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the Cowabunga Collection doesn't just let you relive the arcade glory days, it lets you own them. Both the original 1989 Turtles arcade game and its wildly ambitious NES conversion are fully playable here, side by side. Grab the Cowabunga Collection through my links for an utterly ridiculous 78% off, and while you're there you'll also find huge discounts on Shredder's Revenge, Streets of Rage 4 and even Street Fighter 6 with its season passes, so you can keep the brawling going long after the Turtles have hung up their shells. There are thousands of deals to be had, so happy shopping and I hope you enjoy this video. By now, you'll know the story of the rise of a Turtles franchise. The characters originated from a 1984 comic book series published by Mirage Studios, and they would go on to become mainstream superstars by 1987, after the franchise was successfully expanded into a cartoon series with accompanying toys and other merchandise. In this time frame, like any other popular kids TV show that held gravitas, the franchise would of course receive video games. The first of these would arrive in 1989 in both the arcade and the living room. This year, Nintendo's 8-bit home platform was dominating North America, so it made sense that the Turtles would arrive on the Nintendo Entertainment System. While this game was in development, Konami had an arcade game in the works simultaneously that would deliver an experience in line with the quality of the rest of the Eternal franchise. And unlike its NES counterparts, this one was being built by one of Konami's most talented internal arcade teams. According to interviews with former Konami producers, the company had been weighing up several different licenses at the time, but TMNT's astonishing merchandise sales and unmatched appeal across both Western and Japanese markets made it the obvious choice to anchor a bold new arcade project. The same creative unit that had cut their teeth on crime fighters were now given access to the Turtles license, and they were determined to push the boundaries of what a licensed brawler could be. These days, when it comes to Turtles games of the past, people are most likely to harp on about Turtles in Time, but it would be the 1989 arcade game that would first lay the groundwork for the franchise within the beat-em-up genre. This is the game that cemented the Konami template, a structure and style they would later perfect in The Simpsons and X-Men arcade machines. Even the machines themselves shared a visual language. The bold neon-coloured cabinet art, cartoon-style character portraits, and 4 stick control panel layouts that became hallmarks of Konami's multiplayer brawlers were heavily popularised here. This arcade game, which used the animated TV series as the main source of material, is clearly extremely technically impressive considering how long ago this game was released. Running on Konami's custom 2-board arcade hardware, which housed a Motorola 68000 CPU and a Zilog Z80 sound processor and Yamaha FM sound chip, delivered an audio-visual experience that was leagues ahead of most 1980s arcade machines. Graphically, it was arguably one of the finest looking beat-em-ups in the world upon release. Back in 1989, the Streets of Rage series was yet to exist at all. Golden Axe was in its infancy, and hardly any of the most famous Capcom and Konami beat-em-ups that helped define the genre had ever been released. Even Final Fight would not be released until that same year. In fact, when this cabinet hit arcades, the brawler genre was still relatively primitive, with titles like Double Dragon 2: The Revenge representing the cutting edge of side-scrolling combat. For perspective, the game would go on to earn an estimated $286 million in arcade revenue, dwarfing the take-ins of earlier hits like Double Dragon, which had grossed around a third of that figure just 2 years prior. Turtles then was nothing short of revolutionary, blending the fluidity of Double Dragon with far more complex animations, better hit detection and vastly superior presentation. The game wasn't just a success, it was a phenomenon. It became a monster hit in arcades across the globe, ultimately ranking as the highest grossing dedicated arcade machine of 1990 in North America. It proved beyond doubt that there was an enormous appetite for high-quality licensed games when handled with this level of care and craft. The game was a huge deal. And even if you'd never played this one, it is not at all difficult to guess who the 4 playable characters were going to be. Controls in this game are simple and intuitive, a hallmark of Konami's design philosophy at the time. Cabinets feature 8 directional joysticks paired with 2 buttons, which are predominantly used for jumping and attacking. Basically like all beat-em-ups that had been made up until this point so far. However, Turtles refined that simplicity. Combo inputs could be used to batter foes with flurries of strikes and perform different special attacks unique to each turtle, giving each character a slight sense of identity beyond just their colour-coded bandanas. Characters could even perform additional jumps in specific areas, and enemies could be smashed into walls, often with satisfying sound effects that reflected Konami's attention to detail. The game also features a range of smashable objects, from fire hydrants to barrels that can be destroyed to damage nearby enemies. This was a subtle but important innovation that would become a standard feature in later side-scrolling brawlers, adding a layer of environmental interaction that was almost unheard of back in 1989. Konami even toyed with destructible scenery and hazards here long before such ideas became commonplace, giving the world a sense of interactivity that made stages feel alive rather than static backdrops. For the turtles themselves, attack speed and range also vary depending on which one you choose. Leonardo, as ever, is a balanced all-rounder, while Donatello's bow staff offers extended reach at the expense of speed. Michelangelo and Rembrandt are quicker but more close-range orientated, rewarding aggressive playstyles. This differentiation may seem minor today, but back then it helped elevate Turtles beyond being a simple button masher and encouraged players to experiment with all 4 characters, especially in 4-player sessions where team composition suddenly became a tactical consideration. This idea of character diversity, each with their own strengths and weaknesses, would later become a defining feature of the genre, influencing everything from The Simpsons to Dungeons & Dragons. What a classic!
Hang on, April!
The game's introduction sequence, along with the title's opening cutscene, both serve up the epic and iconic animated series theme tune, faithfully arranged by Konami's Kukuhia Club sound team. It is converted into the game so perfectly that it remains one of the most memorable intros of any late 80s arcade title. The opening scene is simple but effective, depicting the Turtles giving chase after Shredder's kidnap of April O'Neil. This leads directly into the first stage as the 4 Turtles head into a burning building to rescue her. From the very beginning, the game shows off Konami's mastery of arcade spectacle. The camera subtly pans to reveal the environment. The fire crackles with animations rarely seen in beat-em-ups at the time, and enemies enter from multiple planes and directions, techniques that would later become genre staples. The stage opens with surprisingly detailed fire effects for the time, and a variety of foot soldiers to take out, some of whom dramatically burst from behind doorways in the background, giving the level a sense of energy and urgency that few other beat-em-ups had attempted. The foot soldiers come in a variety of different colours, and those colours aren't just for show. Each hue indicates a different combat pattern or weapon type. Some enemies specialise in range Shoryuken throws, while others charge headlong into melee combat. The presence of these distinct enemy types from the very beginning add a surprising amount of tactical consideration, forcing players to constantly adapt to different approaches rather than simply button mash their way through. There are also demolition balls that fall from stairways, which the Turtles must avoid, along with wheeled robot drones that need to be dispatched before they do serious damage. Delving deep into the stage, April O'Neil can be found cowering in an office before a vehicle drills through the floor below, operated by Rocksteady, who acts as the game's first boss encounter. An easy opponent, sure, but one designed to show off the spectacle of the arcade cabinet and ease players into the mechanics. His machine gun projectile attacks demand a bit of spatial awareness, and defeating him is an immensely satisfying payoff to what was, for many kids in 1989, their first taste of Ninja Turtle mayhem in video game form, and my god, was it glorious. After his defeat, Shredder climbs up out of the vehicle, stealing April O'Neil and escaping through one of the building's windows. This brings players onto stage 2, bringing the fight to the streets in a flurry of rage. Some enemy foot soldiers enter the scene via manholes on the stage floor, which is a nice nod early in the game to the accompanying TV show. A small detail, but one that shows how closely Konami's designers were paying attention to the source material and how determined they were to capture the cartoon's atmosphere. It's also worth noting that this stage features a subtle but technically impressive detail: diagonal scrolling in the background corners. This might seem trivial today, but in 1989 this kind of parallax trickery was rare in side-scrolling brawlers, and it helped the stage feel more dynamic and alive. Most games of the era featured completely static backgrounds, but Turtles was already experimenting with techniques that would become commonplace in the genre. In fact, many historians argue that similar flourishes in Streets of Rage 2 several years later were likely inspired by Konami's early experimentation here, a small but telling example of how this game quietly shaped design conventions that would ripple through the beat-em-up world in the years that followed. This time, at the end of the stage, players face off against a laser gun-wielding Bebop. He's a noticeable step up from Rocksteady, not just a heavier hitter, but also equipped with a shoulder tackle and brutal uppercut that can punish careless players. The fight is still relatively straightforward, but it's also far more satisfying, leaning once again into the cartoon's core appeal by pitting you against another fan-favourite villain. This is where the game's boss design philosophy starts to shine. Konami wasn't interested in creating purely mechanical challenges. They wanted these challenges to feel like moments, big, character-driven showdowns that mirrored the spectacle of the cartoon itself. The third stage occurs in the sewers, pulling the game even closer to its source material. Konami's developers clearly understood that part of the Turtles' identity was their subterranean home, and this level revels in that. A cool feature here is that characters can fight on two planes, a relatively uncommon mechanic at the time, as they must jump to exit from the lower waterway. This gave the combat a touch of verticality and spatial awareness, adding another layer of depth to what might otherwise have been a straightforward brawl. Rats can sometimes be seen scurrying in the background, and the dripping pipes and brickwork lend the stage an impressive level of atmosphere for 1989 arcade hardware, grounding the game firmly in the world of a cartoon rather than a generic backdrop. Apart from the robot enemies and foot soldiers, spiky door barriers falling from above also act as damaging obstacles, forcing players to keep moving and staying alert. And then mid-stage we get a special treat, an encounter with Baxter Stockman. Long before his later appearance in Hyperstone Heist, where he would indeed be recycled with far less fanfare, this was the villain's debut in a Turtles video game. It's a clever pacing choice too. Rather than saving him for the end of the stage, Konami uses Stockman as a mid-boss to break up the action and keep the player's adrenaline high, heightening the anticipation for what's to come without interrupting the flow of the level. The stage is not quite over yet though. The Turtles soon arrive in what looks like an underground car park. Some enemies emerge from these cars, while others literally try to run the player over. A surprising and memorable hazard that adds a dash of unpredictability to the fight. These scripted environmental threats, which are practically a standard feature in modern brawlers, were quite forward-thinking in 1989, and once again highlight how Turtles was pushing the genre forward in ways players didn't fully appreciate at the time. The bosses of this stage emerge from a lift as players face off against both Bebop and Rocksteady simultaneously while April watches on from the lift door. This dual battle is one of the first major difficulty spikes in the game, and a taste of the chaotic spectacle Konami was perfecting, a prototype of the multi-boss encounters that would later become staples of their arcade catalogue. Suddenly, positioning, crowd control and co-op coordination matter far more than brute force, and it's here that many players first realised that Turtles was more than a flashy tie-in. It was a genuinely deep and well-designed brawler. After rescuing April, players head towards the secret factory, fighting on a wide open road. This stage feels intentionally different, a refreshing break from the confined interiors. It lets the action breathe and shows off the hardware's ability to handle more enemies and environmental details at once. On this huge, open playing field, characters must avoid enemy traffic while taking down waves of opponents, a creative use of the setting that keeps the experience from feeling repetitive, and once again proves that Konami was willing to experiment with the genre's boundaries long before most other studios caught up. But it's the next portion of a stage that really shows off Konami's ambition. The game shifts into an auto-scrolling section as the turtles ride jet-powered skateboards, battling foot soldiers in attack helicopters and enemies riding skateboards themselves. It's a sudden and exciting change of pace, part brawler, part vehicular shooter, and it debuted here for the very first time. This was a bold innovation, demonstrating that the beat-em-up didn't have to be confined to left-to-right slugfests. Konami was proving that they could lay a spectacle and variety into the genre in ways that few competitors could have even dreamed of, and it was precisely the kind of unexpected twist that helped Turtles stand out in a rapidly crowded arcade market. At this point in the game, you are now trying to save Splinter. The turtles fight their way into the secret factory. The stage area features obligatory laser traps that can damage the player, but Konami uses them cleverly to build tension rather than simply pad out the runtime. Aerial laser-wielding robot enemies also enter the fray, forcing players to juggle vertical awareness as well as horizontal positioning. These mechanical enemies weren't just a difficulty spike, they were a subtle demonstration of how Konami's developers were using hardware power to increase variety. Rather than simply palette swapping foot soldiers again and again, they were constantly introducing new threats with different movement behaviours, attack ranges and vulnerability. This approach, constantly evolving the challenge rather than recycling it, is part of what kept the arcade experience compelling enough to keep players pumping in quarters. Splinter can be found strung up at the end of the stage, guarded by Granitor, a hulking warrior from Dimension X who wields a devastating flamethrower. He's one of the more intimidating bosses in the game, not just because of his power, but because his fire attacks can lock players into hit stun if they're careless. His fight feels like a significant escalation in difficulty, and defeating him to save Splinter serves as one of the most satisfying payoffs in the entire campaign, a reminder that Konami understood the importance of emotional stakes in a genre that was often mechanically focused. Now, this stage is kind of funny to me, as I always joke that most beat-em-ups end with a Technodrome-like level, and sure enough, here we are. This is the first time in a video game where the action takes place abroad the Technodrome itself, making this level the blueprint that so many future brawlers would imitate. Konami have perfected a simple but effective structure. Take the familiar environments from the show and escalate them until the finale feels larger than life. It's an approach that would become the gold standard for licensed arcade titles, and it started right here. This Death Star-like area is absolutely loaded with hazards, gun turrets, laser grids, retracting barriers and endless conveyor belts of robots and foot soldiers determined to stop you. The scale is bigger, the stakes are higher, and the enemies come faster than ever before. All of this helps create a sense of momentum and inevitability. The final confrontation is coming, and there's no turning back now. This level doesn't just feel like a stage, it feels like the final chapter of a Saturday morning cartoon brought to life, and that's exactly the feeling Konami seemed to have wanted players to have. Nearing the end, the Turtles finally face off against one of the most iconic villains in the entire franchise, Krang. Seeing him here was a major moment for fans of the cartoon, and Konami wisely ensured his appearance lived up to expectations. His erratic movement patterns, sudden lunges, and screen-wide beam attacks make this one the most challenging and memorable fight in the entire game yet, and a dramatic set piece that feels every bit as climactic as a season finale. After his defeat, Krang flies the Technodrome, retreating back to Dimension X, leaving only one foe left standing between the Turtles and victory. That foe, of course, is Shredder himself. He's every bit the climactic final boss you'd hope for, fast, aggressive and absolutely merciless, armed with a sword and a sinister device on his helmet that emits demutating lightning capable of killing the Turtles instantly. He's far more dangerous than any opponent you've faced so far. This mechanic was especially memorable for 1989 audiences as it added genuine stakes to the battle. One misstep could result in an instant death, something almost unheard of in beat-em-ups of the time. Perhaps most impressively, Shredder can also create clones of himself, and the game dynamically adjusts the number of clones to be one higher than the number of turtles currently fighting him. This means solo players face 2 Shredders, while a full team of 4 have to contend with 5. A clever piece of dynamic scaling that keeps the finale appropriately daunting regardless of party size. When Shredder or one of his clones nears defeat, his helmet is knocked off, a small but memorable flourish and a unique occurrence in the entire series. It's more than just a neat visual cue, it's symbolic of the once untouchable villain finally being made vulnerable. Defeating him brings the game to its explosive conclusion, showing the wreckage of a technodrome before the end credits finally roll. It's a satisfying ending, not just because it ties a neat bow on the story, but because it caps off one of the most ambitious, technically impressive and downright entertaining arcade experiences of its era. In an age where many licensed games were forgettable cash grabs, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles the arcade game was proof that a tie-in could become a genre-defining masterpiece. In 1989, this excellent game offered both Turtles fans and beat-em-up enthusiasts alike everything they could have possibly wanted in a video game. The gameplay, the stage design, the music, it was all spot on. In fact, it delivered everything to consumers that the 1989 NES game had promised but ultimately failed to achieve. And keeping all of this in mind, it's no surprise at all that it would not be too long before the home version of this arcade smash hit would start to surface. The issue was, though, that despite games like Turtles the arcade game existing, many consumers at home were still playing their games on extremely dated hardware. The first port of the game would be released in 1990, arriving on the Nintendo Entertainment System. The problem was that by this point the Japanese Famicom, the hardware beneath the NES shell, was already 6 years old. Much better home hardware existed, such as the Sega Mega Drive and NEC's TurboGrafx-16, but sadly, the majority of American gamers were still choosing to play on tacky old NESs. That meant even the best home versions could never hope to match the arcade original in presentation, performance or scale, but they could still deliver some fascinating conversions. So in the Turtles' biggest market, North America, the NES was still king. Konami's hand was forced. If they wanted to capitalise on the franchise's runaway popularity, they would have to attempt to squeeze an ambitious, visually spectacular 4-player arcade cabinet experience into a humble 8-bit cartridge. What looked like an impossible task, however, turned out to be surprisingly achievable, and what they ultimately delivered would go down as one of the most beloved home conversions of the 8-bit era. The resulting game, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, was nothing short of a technical marvel considering the hardware's limitations. Konami's developers, many of the same staff who worked on the arcade version, essentially had to rebuild the entire experience from scratch for the 8-bit system, painstakingly recreating the stages, enemies and bosses within the NES's severely limited memory and graphical constraints. Inevitably, compromises had to be made. Enemy counts were reduced, the animation was less fluid, and only 2 players could play simultaneously instead of 4. Yet despite all of this, the core gameplay survived intact. Fast-paced, responsive, and every bit as enjoyable as its arcade counterparts. Not only that, but the team went above and beyond what anyone expected. Rather than simply attempting a straight port, they used the opportunity to expand the experience with brand new content. The NES version includes 2 entirely original levels, a snowy Central Park stage and a Shogun-themed level complete with new enemy types and boss fights that were not present in the arcade game. These additions not only padded out the length of the game, but also gave home players an experience that felt distinct and worth owning, even if they had already pumped their pocket money into the arcade cabinet. The NES release also introduced smaller flourishes to make the most of the home format. For instance, the now infamous Pizza Hut product placement, with signs scattered throughout the levels, reflected the brand's massive sponsorship deals with the franchise at the time. The game's instruction manual even included a voucher for a free pizza. These little touches were emblematic of how Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game, wasn't just a port, it was a cultural moment, a product of its time, and a bridge between the arcade phenomenon and the living room. It was the kind of license release that felt like an event, something more than just a cartridge with a piece of a global craze. For a platform as limited as the NES, this was a genuinely impressive effort. It eclipsed the original NES Turtles game in every conceivable way and became one of the console's most sought-after titles. In fact, many fans who grew up without easy access to the arcades in the late 80s and early 90s actually experienced Turtles the arcade game for the first time through this port. And for them, this was every bit as definitive as the coin-op original. Its success was such that for many years afterwards, the NES version was the version most people thought of when they remembered playing Turtles at home. Now, when it came to being able to sell home conversions of this game to consumers, whilst the NES and its limited capabilities would have caused a lot of tweaking to get the game playable for most American households, Turtles' other huge market, Europe, would present a very different kind of challenge for Konami. In Europe's case, unlike North America, one platform did not dominate. Instead, there was a much more fragmented marketplace, with a variety of competing systems meeting consumers' needs. In fact, Nintendo massively botched the launch of the NES in Europe, and as a result, the platform never really caught on to the same degree on the continent as it did in Japan and North America. Only in Norway, Sweden and a handful of other northern European countries was the console even remotely dominant, and that was largely thanks to the aggressive sales tactics of a bullish distributor locally, rather than anything Nintendo actively done themselves. That, however, is a story for another time. In order to truly conquer Europe with the Turtles brand, Konami needed to bring the arcade experience to a range of home computer formats, and this was no small task. The ZX Spectrum, Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, DOS PCs, and Commodore 64 were all wildly different machines, each with their own technical quirks and limitations. Achieving anything resembling consistency across them was extremely difficult, and in many ways it was a far tougher development challenge than the NES port had been. So to achieve this, the solution was to license out the home computer conversions. In 1991, the arcade game was published in Europe by Imageworks and ported by Probe Software, who were tasked with adapting it for this wide spread of systems. Sadly, none of these ports would have the same cultural or commercial impact as the NES version, mostly because of the same level of resources and development talent was never poured into them. Many versions suffered from choppy frame rates, clunky controls, and downgraded visuals, all of which undermined the punchy, fast-paced combat that made the arcade original so special. On some platforms, gameplay even slowed to a crawl when too many enemies appeared on screen, stripping away much of the kinetic chaos that defined the coin-op experience. The reviews reflected this. The One magazine in Britain famously described the 16-bit and home computer editions as pretty poor interpretations of a pretty poor yet popular subject, criticising the simplistic enemy AI, predictable attack patterns and repetitive gameplay. Most players agreed. These ports were functional enough to cash in on the Turtles' craze, but they lacked the magic and polish that had made the arcade experience such a phenomenon. This feedback was fair. Most of the home computer conversions felt like afterthoughts, rushed, compromised versions that never came close to capturing the magic of the coin-op original. The ZX Spectrum port was forced to operate with a limited colour palette, 2-channel sound, and restrictive memory, which resulted in a blocky visual, clashing colours, and severely simplified gameplay. Enemy sprites often flickered, scrolling was choppy, and the pace was sluggish compared to the arcade original. Despite these drawbacks, this version remained technically impressive given the Spectrum's hardware. Both Amiga and Atari ST versions were substantially more capable than the 8-bit formats, sporting enhanced colour and clearer audio, but still lagged behind the arcade quality. Animation was noticeably less fluid, and objects were smaller and less detailed. These versions did include the core level progression and multiplayer features, but reviews criticised the simplistic enemy AI and lack of challenge versus the original. As for the Amstrad CPC edition, it stood somewhere between the Spectrum and 16-bit machines in capabilities. Graphics looked sharper than the Spectrum's, but still retained a blocky, muted appearance. Sound effects were sparse, and input lag contributed to sluggish controls. As with most 8-bit ports, multiplex sprites and background flicker were common. The C64 port offered a somewhat livelier colour palette and bleepy sound effects, but cuts to gameplay were especially apparent. Characters and enemy sprites were simplified and scrolling was jerky, levels were condensed and combat slowed considerably when more sprites appeared. The C64 version's 2-player mode allowed co-op play, but it was nowhere near arcade speed or smoothness. The DOS PC port had technical strengths depending heavily on the user's hardware. On high-end PCs with EGA, VGA graphics and decent sound cards, it fared better visually and sonically than many others, but poor optimization meant that even with superior specs, the experience was rarely arcade-like. Controls were widely criticised as unresponsive, and enemy encounters felt repetitive due to the memory constraints and basic programming. Across all versions, critics unanimously noted the lack of polish, frequent slowdowns, compromised sprite work, and choppy gameplay. The NES version, developed in-house by Konami, remained the gold standard, whereas these European home computer conversions, outsourced and quickly produced to hit retail, became destined to be remembered as middling cash-ins. Fortunately, you do not need to sacrifice your precious time playing with any of these tripe offerings anymore, as the Cowabunga collection not only gives us modern access to the NES conversion, but the original arcade game too. Grab the Cowabunga collection through my links for an utterly ridiculous 78% off, and while you're there you'll also find huge discounts on Shredder's Revenge, Streets of Rage 4 and even Street Fighter 6 with its season passes, so you can keep the brawling going long after the Turtles have hung up their shelves. There are thousands of deals to be had, so happy shopping and I'll see you all again soon. Cheerio!